Well, why don't we get started? I just wanted to welcome everyone here today, and I'm going to share my screen for 1 second, I hope, or not. Okay, here we go. As you know, today's event is the first ever virtual GIS day run by the GeoTech Center. And the GeoTech Center has, as you know, a lot of stuff going on today. But you can also visit their website to learn more about the kinds of things that they do, their curriculum resources and professional development opportunities. And something new this year is virtual office hours. So if you're a teacher or a student or even a professional who has a GIS question, if you go on there, you can get some answers to your questions. So we want to thank Dr. Headley for being here today, and she's going to introduce herself and begin her presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and make sure everybody's from the waiting room.
All right, I love it. Thank you very much. I'm just making sure I can share. Good morning / afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. It's great to be here. My name's Dr. Rachel Headley. I came up through aerospace. I was at the end of my career. Well, I started, since you guys are geo nerds, you know all these things. So I started as an image analyst way back, right out of college, my very first job. And then I went off to get my master's degree in paleoecology, but a geography degree. Then I came back to geospatial work, but even in my ecology work, I did geospatial. I was looking at the connections, right, between my site and other sites and the flows of information. And then I came back to geospatial work, image analysis. I worked with the United Nations Environmental Program for a while to bring data to decision-making about environmental disasters and funding, emergency funding. And then I went into more research work, image analysis. I got to work with iGet, which is where I know Craig, where I know Anne. I'm not sure if we have any other iGetters in the group, but I had a real privilege to work on the iGet program, and where I know Nikki, who is one of the organizers of the event. And then I, at the top of my career, I was the operational science officer of the Landsat satellite mission. So I was part of the team that oversaw, for those of you who've been in the industry for a while, I was part of the team that oversaw the migration from a cost model on Landsat to a no cost model. And so that experience actually led me to get really nerdy about how people deal with big changes and how to deal with things like pandemic changes and classroom things and working from home and some of those big changes in the world. So what I do now is I started a business consultancy at first just around geospatial work, but now it's expanded into implementing change at companies, all kinds of companies, from manufacturers to aerospace to insurance. And we work all over the US, Canada, and Europe. And we've been working remotely for 5 years. So the pandemic has kind of leveled the playing field a lot for us, but it's also a time where people really need support. So when Chris Cruz, also an iGetter, asked me to participate in this day, I thought one of the fun things that I always see, once you get a geography mindset and a GIS mindset and a geospatial mindset, you start seeing the influence of geospatial technology everywhere you go. And so many people don't even know that's what they're doing. Like, how many drone programs do we know that are over in precision ag? They know they're doing geospatial, but it's not the focus of what they do. So when I'm out working with companies all over, doing really creative and fun things with industry, I keep coming into these future trends where geospatial thinking and analysis is embedded in the core of what they do, but often they don't even really think of it that way. And so I thought it'd be really fun to get a group together that is experts in this sort of thing and kind of share what I'm seeing in big trends, future trends, and how I see geospatial fitting in, which you'll probably all be like, yeah, that makes sense to me. But I'd also love your feedback on what things aren't on my list that you think that are coming, that are going to be critical geospatial analysis thinking and processes will be critical to the success of those future trends. So at some point, there will be participation points awarded. And so I want you all to have an A in my class. So feel free to unmute and ask a question, interrupt me if you'd rather put a message in the chat. Tamara's going to be keeping an eye on the chat window. But yeah, feel free to pop in if you have a question or have a comment as we go. And I will invite feedback as we go too, so don't be afraid to contribute. Lord knows we are all on enough boring Zoom meetings that we don't need this to be yet another one. So please feel free to contribute and engage. So I'm gonna share my slide deck because I had the most fun ever going out and getting some geospatial examples of all of the trends that I wanted to talk about. And of course it sent me into wild rabbit holes on all the things that you guys are doing on a day-to-day basis. So it's really, really fun. All right. Any questions to get started before I launch off into some of my slides here? I can't see you. Hold on. I'm going to move you over. We do training all over the world, so I've kind of got how I like to see your faces. And again, please unmute your video if you like, so I can see you. All right, so flying cars are TEOWAKI. So who in the room knows what TEOWAKI means before you had to Google it? Did anyone know what TEOWAKI was? Oh, you guys are all just so, I don't know. I love anyone want to cop to they knew what TEOWAKI is? I mean, it's a little more obscure than zombie apocalypse, but it's kind of along the same lines. Huh. So, you're not preppers at all, which is a little disappointing, but it's a really interesting world. And so it's so fascinating because flying cars are like such a core, like, drones are eventually going to get big and fly around people and things and all that stuff. And to me, that's such a high-tech future, but there is a huge chunk of people that are worried about the collapse of civilization as we know it, right? So so even in that world, I can see geospatial influences in that world. And that's such a different world than the flying car world or the drone world that we often live in, that I just thought it was so fascinating. We could have these very two, end of the world and flying cars, and geospatial is sick through all of it. And it's really, really interesting. I see the chat window firing off here. So I got to see what's going on the chat window. Who's copying to knowing the things? I can't see it. Shoot. What does it say? Tell me what it says, Tamara. I can't read it.
So it says, I almost likely will be video bound by my dogs. Okay. I thought it might be Star Wars reference.
I love it.
I just looked it up and I'm laughing.
Right? I love it. Okay, perfect. I got the chat window, so now I can see it. So thank you very much. So yeah, right? I mean, so this is a whole world. And if you think about the prepping space, the end of the world as we know it, bottom right-hand corner here, is there has been a core group of people since like the 50s, really. They can track back this movement of, then it was the Cold War, then it was like 9/11, and now it's become this more geospatial, but it's always been a geospatial, geopolitical concern about how the world's going to fall apart. So anyway, it's fascinating. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the picture, the GIF on the left here, the animation, is from The Fifth Element, which is sort of the futuristic world. It was a futuristic world showing all these flying cars. And the interesting thing about this is that the FAA is, if you don't know, which I didn't know till March. I went to an event in March. I was invited to participate in an event, and the FAA is already designing how we move around with flying cars, basically. So really some interesting stuff, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So it's kind of the two extremes, and then every future in between those has a lot to do with geospatial work. This picture on the bottom right is the Book of Eli. It's a Denzel Washington movie. If you're into post-apocalyptic stuff, it's a pretty good one if you haven't seen it. All right, so the trends I wanted to talk about today, which to me are both sort of mega trends that we're seeing across the globe, that all have a geospatial component. Now, of course, when I put a thing on my Facebook page this week and I said, tell me everybody, I'm prepping for this talk. What are your favorite trends? And I had some people that were like, love and acceptance around the world, which would be a fantastic global trend, but that is harder to connect geospatial technology to. But we could probably track it. There's a geographer somewhere who's doing it. So the future that I wanted to talk about, some big trends that I want to talk about. One is the decarbonization of power. I think that's definitely a trend. It's got some legs, but it's going to get bigger as we go. More humans, right? I remember in the 90s, getting to 7 billion people was like this huge news. And I heard a lot less about it. And it might be because I'm out of the academic circles a little more than I used to be. But I just haven't heard about population pressure as much. The space, I think the very exciting recent developments in space with SpaceX being the new shuttle is very exciting. eVTOL, so that's electric vertical takeoff and landing. So it's a drone, but the conversation around that as an industry is much bigger than drones. It's becoming much more about human taxis, carrying people, carrying packaging. How do we transition from a wheeled transportation network to an airborne transportation network on an individual level? Prepping, that's our TEOWAKI piece. The illusion of privacy. So, I phrased it that way intentionally because I think we all think we have privacy, but I think the more we see evidence on the landscape, the less that may be true. And then resource scarcity is another one that, of course, embedded in that is climate change. But climate change is such a massive, overwhelming trend. I felt like it was hard to sort of sneak down into it.
So, Dr. Healy?
Yes.
Oh, we do have a question. So, is it not true that the world's shrinking? I was shown a few videos in my world geography class that places such as Italy are paying immigrants to live there.
Yeah, from a global perspective, I think global shrinking is a little bit of a first world phenomena. If you think about, it's true that technology is breaking into rural areas of Africa, into rural areas of other places. In fact, there's places in Africa that they skipped the landline version of technology and went right to cell phones because that's so much more sense. And so in some cases it's shrinking that way. But I think as far as the population goes, how I think about it, it's really about population pressure and how people are urbanizing over the globe. So yes, there's lots of aspects of every one of these. You start digging in, and I'll show some examples of how I sort of approached it. There's just a ton of other aspects of each one of these that you could really dig into that geospatial thinking and processes are critically important too. Yeah, Anne, where do we get the water? She is a desert dweller, so she knows exactly what that's about. So yeah, let's talk more about that, Corbin, as we move forward. So I actually want to start with resource scarcity, and Anne's going to be just so excited because that's basically the piece I was driving into. So when you start looking at resource scarcity, whether it's industrial agriculture, local food, there was a moment about 3 or 4 years ago, where there was a drought in Florida and California, and industrially grown tomatoes were more expensive in our big grocers, were more expensive than our locally grown tomatoes that are grown by hand with love and care by the human that you know. And so that, I feel like, was a critical turning point in how climate change will affect how industrial ag is going to maybe equal out, overbalance local food pricing and organic growing practices. So lots of interesting, and if somebody in academics, at whatever level you are, will do an analysis of that, I would love that. That was my last AAG meeting I went to. And I asked the question about, I was expecting geographers and geospatial analysts to be like, yeah, look at this great data, like the drought versus the ag and how local food is connected. And no one's doing it. I couldn't find one session at the AG where people were connecting the dots on this local food to industrial food and how climate change is going to change the balance of that in a geospatial way, not even talking about it. So someone go do that. It's so important and interesting. Transportation, Coca-Cola was one of the very first companies in the world to have a climate analyst on their payroll. And they were and this was in the 90s, they were studying how it would disrupt their transportation networks around the world. So transportation is going to be key, and shipping and tying that into business is going to be key.
So there's another question.
Yeah.
Is that part of the food desert issue?
Food desert issue can be possibly solved. Well, there's a couple different solutions for food deserts. One is the idea of food desert, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, is that there isn't food available in certain areas for certain people. So food deserts are more about access to food. And so sometimes you can solve that through local food. I had a long conversation with someone about urban food deserts and how we can overcome those by local gardening or incorporating gardening into urban areas and urban developments. So yes, in some ways, but frankly, in a lot of food deserts, there's a massive gap between not only access to fresh food, but how do you prepare it? How do you fix it? How do you create meals from local food? So what we've found in my local food work is that we have to pair it often with training on how you prepare food. What do you do with the eggplant? I mean, not that we have to eat eggplant. I don't like kale, so I don't grow kale either. But, what do we do with the food that we grow? If I give you a basket of fresh food, I don't even know what to do with it. Most people don't, especially people that have had long-term food deserts in their communities. So there's a lot there. Again, like digging into these issues is the juicy, yummy parts of a lot of it. Location of fresh water. In the 90s, when I was back in college, these many years ago, we were talking a lot about World War III, maybe around access to water, the big next conflict. Of course, the next ones were oil and other geopolitical challenges, but that's still a critically important piece. And then the thing that I really thought interesting is about climate refuges. So not just the human systems, but also, of course, the natural systems. And so I actually found this really cool graphic that made by the Audubon and NOAA. And each one of these lines is about, okay, this is the spruce grouse. This was its habitat in 1966. And this is their winter habitat now in 2005, 2006, which was already 15 years ago. So to see how natural systems are also being changed, migration patterns, and this is heavy implication here, right? That if this is the natural movement of animals that can adjust their range, then, as we try to lock that agriculture into the same range that has been historically good for growing, it's just going to take a huge amount of inputs, right, to keep those industrial ag systems going in the places that they've always been. So it's just fascinating that we're seeing natural things move, but we're trying to lock in the human aspects of those. All right, Corey's got a question. Part of the problem from an indigenous perspective is being given food that we don't traditionally eat. That is for sure. And in fact, another big problem is good, well-intentioned people showing up into indigenous communities and sort of telling them how the kind of food they should eat and grow. And so hopefully at least in our areas where we have a large indigenous population, there's a lot more emphasis on partnering and learning from our indigenous partners and what they can teach us and how we can support them in maintaining and developing their own heritage varieties, the food that they traditionally make and create and grow. And so hopefully there is a trend more toward that in your area too. But that's the responsible way that a lot of local food practitioners are behaving these days. So just thinking back to the migration of plants and animals. And of course, a lot of plants can't keep this up, and there's all kinds of extinction challenges that are going on. And so just to think about this trend in a geospatial way, everything about this is geospatial. That's the easiest one. So I thought I'd start with that one. And a lot of you probably have a lot of other aspects of how you're thinking about resource scarcity and climate change in your work.
Yeah, Anne just posted, understanding too the trade-offs, sea salt and kale, loss of iodine for the human brain.
Yeah, well, kale. But yeah, I mean, right, it is fascinating how are the trends of just food consumption and how that affects the resource scarcity. I remember I did a study back in college. I was an environmental geographer for my undergraduate. And one of the things I looked at was the desert Southwest and the water issues there. And one of the fun things about that was understanding that I thought I was ready to like point fingers at the cities about their water consumption. Because I've been to Phoenix and flown over Phoenix and see all the golf courses with ponds. And I'm like, what is happening? But what I found out is 80% of the water, at least at that time, was used by agriculture, growing cotton and growing other things that probably shouldn't have been growing there. So, you know, really interesting when you start digging into trends and legacy crop growing and all kinds of things, lots of, and not to, there's no, in my mind, there's no villains here. This is not a, you're bad because you do this. This is a understanding of why they're there and how they do it and how we can be smarter and more clever about moving into the future.
And Corey just posted, non-human migration in response to climate change affects disease vectors.
Oh, disease, especially combining with extreme events and disease vectors and migration due to non-climate change issues. So lots and lots going on. So the next big trend I want to chat about was the decarbonization of power. And so I like this term. I've kind of changed, instead of renewable energy, to decarbonization, because I feel like that's really what we're talking about. We're trying to get off carbon-based power. And I love immediately when I started thinking about this. So I live in an off-grid house, all solar. We're not on the power grid at all. And so it's a fantastic lifestyle. I love it. No complaints at all. And so we're kind of tuned into this a lot more than the average household. And even we're building a new business building for my company. And that's going to be a net zero building where we generate more power than we use. We have to be tied into the grid due to city rules, but we're going to have a big solar array so that we can offset the amount of power we're using. So thinking about how does geospatial fit in, of course, the challenge of decarbonization of power is that where we're at often determines the kind of power we have available to us. So whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, we are the geography around which we find ourselves. Now, carbon has managed to diffuse itself away from their core places and take that away and allow us, me living far away from any carbon source, use carbon-based power. Of course, what we need to do with decarbon power is storage and battery power and how we ship that around. So that's going to create an interesting geography as we can develop those sources. So this is a great example too of this is solar irradiance based on the idea that we have to understand what kind of power we can generate depending on where we are. So there's some really cool geospatial work going on in this space. And so whether it's local power creation, site evaluation, the densities, right? I mean, we have crazy wind here. We could have wind turbines going all the time, but nobody lives where I live. We have like 10,000 people in my town. So yes, we should have enough to offset that, but it's not where the big population centers are. So how do we balance population densities with where we can currently get decarbonized power? Anne is sharing that she's worried about the effects of solar. If everyone's using it, we're trapping energy that might not have been trapped. Is there a problem with that? I think I have not read a study about that. I have not. I think the question also is what solar panels, what's the coverage of solar panels to actually use solar power, right? So if we have to cover acres and acres and acres and acres and acres of land, what is the trade-off? And so, yes, I think those kind of like massive scale studies probably haven't explored that, or I haven't seen that in the literature yet. And that's sort of and I think solar is becoming much more efficient too. So, it's back in the day when we started storing data on big hard drives, we literally had an entire floor plan of how much data we were going to need. But as technology's improved, we've actually needed less and less data to store the same amount of information. And we've seen that in solar technology also, photovoltaic anyway, where it used to be pretty inefficient and very expensive. And now it's becoming very, very efficient and much, much smaller. And the battery technology is also keeping up. So yes, those are trends we need to keep an eye on all of those pieces, and geospatial related trends also. And then shifting wealth. I think that was one of the things too that I was really interested in when I started thinking about geography and geospatial impacts. If we take the money out of the carbon focused companies, the oil companies and the natural gas companies, and we start creating our own power, how does that change the distribution of wealth in that side of the economy? And would it have an impact? And that is kind of stuff I think is just really fascinating things to think about. One example of that is moving out of coal. These are, each purple dot is what do they call it? They retired coal plants, I guess, decommissioned. And then the green is the county. And then I've tied it into coal mining employment. So we have seen this is a geographically specific economic consequence of the decarbonization of power, right? So one aspect of it. So I think there's just a huge amount of interesting geospatial trends on this kind of thing, for sure. The next topic I wanted to touch on is more humans. So I was really interested in this because, like I said, I hadn't heard much about it. So this is a density map. Now, the other cool thing about this is this was basically, I pulled it off Reddit, and there is so much democratization of mapping technology right now that it is really exciting to see like rando person who's a map nerd creating interesting stuff. Now, of course, there isn't rigor behind this. We don't really know how it was created, but in that sense, academically, but I love that it's becoming more interesting to people. Then they recognize that geography is such a key to understanding things. So here's just a persons per square kilometer map, which was super cool to see. But then the thing I really love, again, is like, what's the next level down is like, here's a refugee map. So this is a United Nations map. You can find it at therefugeproject.org. So cool. It's basically every line is people from that. And you can click on each state and see how people are migrating and where they're coming from or to. You can switch sharing to or from. So it's this super interactive map. Now, to those of us in academics, I want to know way more about this. Like, tell me more. I want to cut the data this way or that way. But this is meant for the average human to understand the patterns. And I think it also speaks to another geospatial challenge, which is how do we take the data and make it information, which I know is what you guys think about all the time, but I still see it as a struggle because we're so into it that a lot of the stuff I see is like, oh, well, if you're a data nerd or a geo nerd, you totally get that. But if you're an average person, this is so much more powerful in many ways. So it's just something to consider, a little drum beat for you guys.
There's a couple of statements here.
Yes.
Bad map projection for density.
Yeah.
Man.
Oh yeah. Can we just get off Mercator, please? Like, I thought the same thing, Ann, 100%. Like, we need to get off this.
Yeah. And then he said, you mentioned Reddit, not much of a user, but a friend had turned him on to subreddit called Data is Beautiful.
Yeah, and if you noticed on the URL too on that Reddit from the last, it's all called map porn. There's a whole conversation about map porn. So it's definitely, data is beautiful, mapping, there's like, it's such a great space. You can really find a lot of stuff online these days. So let's talk about space. I have wanted to go to space since I was a kid. I was in 6th grade when one of the shuttle disasters happened. But I was super tuned in to all the space stuff, really thought it was awesome. Even after, I think it was the Columbia disaster in 2003, I applied to the space program because I thought, oh, maybe no one else is applying right now and maybe I can get in. So like I was super excited to get in. Of course, they don't recognize geography as a science discipline, you know, boo, but so I've been really excited about it. But I've always said that you will need people to map the map space. So I kind of was nerding out about some of the mapping that's going to need to be taking place. And frankly, I think a way that geospatial can really dig into the space side is that they don't have a lot of their three-dimensional mapping is crap over there. So as the tools that you guys use for LiDAR and for your three-dimensional panning and map creation, I think if, you know, looking at up-leveling the space, you know, the space people, their mapping would be massively helpful. So kind of digging in, if we could make some inroads into, you know, the physics and the mapping of space, the astronomy folks, I think that'd be hugely helpful. They stink at it, frankly. I was really excited to go dig around for some kind of three-dimensional moving map of Milky Way or something, and they just don't have it. They just don't have it. So really, geospatial could really dig into this. I think you guys could really support them a lot. So this is a side view of the Milky Way and how it's shaped, and they're developing more and more understanding about the three-dimensionality by looking at, of course, it's way complicated. They're looking at an image taken today and an image taken 30 years ago from the same telescope, and they're looking at the direction of where everything's moving, and then they're creating this three-dimensional view. So it's not that the data is simple, but you guys are data experts. You guys are spatial data experts. So I think geospatial has a huge future in the space program as we build it out. I see Corey's mentioning data quality. Always data quality, right? Always data quality. And sort of like that, we have the trained eye to like Anne was like, that is a terrible projection, which we get, right? But at the same time, what is the message we're sharing? Is the message, look at the density of China versus Central Africa, or what are we trying to share? What's the information we're trying to impart? And so yeah, data quality, you can always lie with data, right? And so that is always an issue. But I think the exciting thing is we have more and more people understanding that geospatial is critical. And to me, that's the win. That's the win. So eVTOL, this is my current favorite sort of super nerd space. There's a ton of really interesting stuff going on. My dream is to have a landing pad in my backyard so I can just get in my little giant drone basically and fly to wherever I need to go. It's going to be amazing someday. So really, really interesting stuff going on. But who's doing it often? Like we know drones, right? We know drones, we have the software, we have the FAA licensing, we know all that stuff. But who's making these things tend to be the helicopter companies, or they're a startup with aerospace or aeronautics background. They don't have the geospatial inputs. They're using the hell out of it, and that's how they're growing their companies. But they don't have a lot of geographers or geospatial experts on their teams. And so it's almost like they're kind of fumbling into this space where they should be having you and your students and your colleagues buried into this and doing really awesome work in here, in this kind of work. So this marriage of business and geospatial is bridging that gap between academics and business is becoming more and more critical in all of these examples. So I'm not going to play this video because it's already 2:35 on the official schedule, and I only have 10 minutes left, but it is worth the 4-minute look. but just Google eVTOLs and just nerd out about it. It's really, really cool. And to see all the different designs, this is basically a drone design. You can't see it, but there's it's like basically a quadcopter on steroids. But there's lots of different styles. There's lots of different thoughts and creative structures around it. This was the coolest one. This is, I think it's British or European, but anyway, check it out. But again, to go with the next step, where's geospatial really going to dig in? I think this is it. So this is the first concept of operations from the FAA about how to manage flying everything. So this is UAM for people that aren't in the space. It's urban air mobility. So, and even though we're really talking about rural also, but that's sort of the idea. So, and everything from, what if one of these things falls out of the sky and kills somebody? Or do we want it flying over, your neighborhood? Or do we want it following the road path, but just at certain latitudes or certain elevations, I guess? So how does this work? And so the FAA's taken this first stab at, okay, we have these low-lying aircrafts, we have high-flying aircrafts, so all the elevations, altitudes is what I'm looking for, altitudes. And so they kind of got there. And so you can see here we have the little guys down here at these levels, and how are we actually going to do it? So huge challenge. If you start thinking about it, everybody has to have highly accurate altimeters and geospatial awareness. Or do they tagging off cell towers so that everyone has the same thing? Are they tagging off, I don't know, something else? Are we going to have places to land? How are they going to use it? How are we going to geospatially manage this in an urban area? We're going to have things going across the landscape, and what does that mean? So this three-dimensional geospatial space is just such an interesting space. And of course, these guys got lambasted for this because, half the people thought it was terrible. The other half people thought it was marginal. And then a few people thought it was okay, kind of deal. But it's their first shot at it. And if you just Google, the UAM ConOps, you're going to find this PDF. And I can share this. I put all the links in this PowerPoint, so if anyone wants it, I can send it out. It's nothing secret in here. So you can find it and look through it if this is kind of a nerdy, interesting thing for you. Or, make your students go do some, research on it. But NASA's already having meetings about how they can support this industry. So I was invited as an industry person, as a business person, who had insight into geospatial stuff to come and think about how can we help build the workforce to feed into this industry. Because you can imagine you might need geospatial experts in every single company, at every single federal agency that's focused on this. And how do we actually make this a reality if in 10 years we have thousands of these things flying? So it's really, really interesting. Oh, can you please put the link in the chat box? Oh, thank you. Hold on. Yeah, I have to get out of the presentation mode. Hold on. You have to watch me do PowerPoint now for a minute. All right, chat box, there we go. All right, there you've got it. Good idea, thank you. So that's eVTOLs. And I actually tried to get an eVTOL program started at one of my local universities, but it's just a little too nascent for the geospatial piece. It's still a lot about the tech, like the actual flying of people around safely, but it's coming, it's coming. Okay, so prepping, the TEOWAKI piece. So you wouldn't think that would have a huge amount to do with it, but honestly, if you start really digging into people that think the world might end someday, then people start talking about where should I live? So this is kind of a terrible cartography map, but you get the idea of they've identified population centers over 100,000 and a buffer zone around it, assuming that would be a target of some kind of attack. And then where the places are that you should go live that are away from humans. So interesting. The other piece is understand the geopolitical. So there's a lot of conversations actually about the geography of infrastructure power networks, what's going on in the world, like they always have a very sort of extremist view of what's the worst case scenarios. Of course, that's kind of how they're wired, but they are actually quite interestingly aware of the geopolitical and the geography around them, and frankly, how it's all connected together.
So there's a few comments.
Yes.
Safety would be the primary concern. If the flying system worked like a bus route system, that would be more comforting than a ton of individuals with their own flying car.
Yeah, right. Especially when they could fall out of the sky and onto you.
Yeah.
Squish you.
And then Megan said, I've always told my husband that GIS will save us if the world ends.
Yeah, right. Amen. Woo.
Yeah. The next question, I have a question, but need to type it. I was going to get my Part 107 license, but COVID-19 prevents the testing. How do you think the UAM will impact that license, expand or limit?
I don't think it's related at this point. The urban air mobility stuff is really theoretical, and it's really about creating the structure around all the flying vehicles that are going to happen. I think it will be interesting to figure that out. They're thinking about that too, in the sense of, does everyone that sits in a drone, a big taxi drone as an example, need to have a, Part 107? Probably that's not realistic. So who's going to be controlling the pieces, and how is all that going to feed in? So yeah, that's a concern from who needs to be licensed to use the UAM systems and all that stuff. I imagine FAA has very, very high, very rigorous rules around all of that stuff. So I'm sure they're going to come out with that. I think eventually it will require more people to have it. But short term, probably won't impact it very much.
And then Craig posted a link to timeshares for preppers in Colorado.
All right. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Someone's making tons of money on it. And then, of course, the most fun thing that I see, which is you and I kind of 101 stuff, is everyone's trying to figure out how to use a compass. Like, they're like, have your maps, but no one knows how to read maps anymore, or how to navigate with maps. So part of the geocaching sort of interest has actually bled over into the prepper side, because they're using it to learn how to navigate by compass in case the world ends. So, thanks, Craig. See you soon. All right, so we're out of time, so I'm just going to pop through a couple more examples and we'll get out of here. So illusion of privacy. So I live down the road from the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, the largest congregation of humans since the pandemic started. Not really something I'm proud about, but that's what it was. So there was a lot of geospatial use of cell phone location about where people came from and where people went, to sort of try to track things. That really shocked a lot of people that we were able to do that. And so that is happening. The thing that's interesting to me is that what I'd like to use it for, which isn't available now, but some of you should go sort this out for me, is using cell phone data so I can go where other people aren't. Like, can I go to a state park how many people are going to be there? Can I go to a piece of beach where no one's there? Can I go to some place that feels more safe? So I think that would be a really amazing application, to use this mobility data from your cell phones, or this mobile data, to figure out where people aren't. And in real time would be freak. I don't know if we can get it in real time yet, but somebody has it. So I think the illusion of privacy is a big one. So anyway, we're out of time. So unfortunately, we don't have a chance to take your feedback, but I love that you've been doing it all along. So if you have any interests, future trends, please contribute in the chat if you want to hang out. I can hang out for a few minutes if you'd like, but I know a lot of you have other commitments you have to run off to. So thank you very much for your time. It was really fun to see your face and to interact with you. Hi, Anne. Thanks for turning on your video so I can see your face. And thank you everyone else for turning on your video so I can see your face. It makes my experience a lot more full. So I appreciate it very much. So awesome. Thanks everybody. I guess no more questions. So be safe, and I will talk soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank
bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. See you soon.
That was amazing.
Thank you. It was fun, right? You
Yes.
got to do the fun stuff.
No, thank you so much. I'm really happy that I got to hear you speak. That was awesome.
Thanks, Megan. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
I have to go eat lunch because my session is coming.
All right. All right.
All right. Well, I guess I'll leave. And I'll see you at what is it? 4?
4, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
All right. See ya.